Hello, my name is Sarah Champion. Welcome to the speakers and the parliamentarians here today. This is the first session of the APPG on Street Children's 2022 inquiry into exploitative child labour. Before we get started, please note this session will be recorded to enable us to utilise the evidence received in our report. As it's a webinar, only the panellists, our speakers, and any parliamentarians joining online will be visible in the recording. Children in street situations are disproportionately likely to be involved in child labour, including the most dangerous and exploitative forms of work. Estimates have shown that child labour has increased during the pandemic, despite the Sustainable Development Goals calling for the total eradication of child labour by 2025. This inquiry will attempt to understand what continues to drive children into dangerous and exploitative labour and what can be done to prevent it. We'll be holding a series of live evidence sessions such as this one, alongside our call for repeat submissions, which can be found online. And one of my colleagues will post the link in the chat box today. I encourage all of our speakers today to submit written evidence alongside their oral testimony. The evidence gathered through this inquiry will be turned into a report at the end of this year, which will provide recommendations to the UK government. This session will provide us with an introduction to some of the key issues in child labour today. In the UK, conversations continue to hit the headlines regarding the use of child labour and other forced and exploitative labour in sectors including the chocolate industry, as highlighted in the recent Channel 4 Dispatches programme, and the garment sector. Despite these and many other scandals over the years, child labour is persisting and worsening. Are global efforts really being put in the right place? We will examine what more governments, businesses and NGOs can and should be doing to tackle this issue, and exactly why child labour is such a difficult problem to solve. We'll begin now with brief presentations from our speakers, and then we'll move on to the questions and answers with our parliamentarians. So, could I ask, have we got our first speaker? Yes. Could I ask our first speaker, Fatimah, could you introduce yourself, your job, and a little bit about the organisation you work for and what you do, and then if you could give us the overview presentation.
That's great, thank you. Hi, my name is Fatimah Keheller and I am the Head of Research and Programmes Policy at ActionAid UK. I've been working in the area of women's rights for about 20 years now. And today I will actually be bringing you a presentation that actually frames some of these issues within a wider macro context. So the brief I was given to speak to child labour through the lens that we use on adolescent girls and women's economic rights more broadly, and why it's actually important to have that framing when we're addressing this issue of child labour and street children as an addition to that. I do have a presentation, so I'm wondering if I could ask, I think it's Ellie, to put that up, and this will just help me to give some visuals to some of what we've been doing. So as I mentioned, we do have a focus on women and girls within ActionAid UK, and we incorporate feminist principles into that work very critically, and also draw on global Southern feminist thought leadership as part of our framing. Now, adolescent girls are a core focus of our work portfolio. And when you look at it from the fact that, they fall within that broad space between childhood and adulthood where rights can arguably be easily far more exploited. And in terms of our economic rights and justice positioning, which goes beyond, the productivity angle and the idea of individual graft and income earning, we are looking at the right to be economically secure whilst maintaining your legal right to still remain a child and not to have to work. So I'm going to go through some findings from some girl-led research very quickly, and then I want to situate that more firmly within the wider approach to women's economic rights and justice that we use, and then some considerations for a gender-just COVID-19 recovery if we are really to try and address these issues. So if I can ask to go to the next slide quickly, please. Thank you. So this is our recent report, and actually my colleagues are launching this somewhere else in Parliament today. So it's quite a big day for us, and I'll speak to it very quickly. Basically, we looked at 3 countries, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and Indonesia. And I'm going to give you some of the findings from Indonesia in particular, just to give us some of the background and the context. You know, we know that we have seen a decline in incomes during the pandemic, and this has led to a direct reduction in direct spending on girls' education, which within this particular case study, we saw a resurfacing of work as the benchmark for a child's future within communities, as more girls inevitably ended up dropping out of school. And you saw increased vulnerability and exposure to child labor on the back of that, particularly in the informal sector. I think it's worth noting that with this economic crisis, as opposed to the financial crisis, which I'm sure many of us still remember quite starkly, the income impacts have been in sectors where women work, and we know this has a knock-on effect on children and on girls in particular, and for adolescent girls, again, in that space between childhood and adulthood, we see an additional knock-on effect. So we saw girls moving into work as opposed to being in school, and this exposed them to informal sector work in particular, where there are minimal protections, including from violence. A lot of girls within the Indonesian context did move into the domestic workspace in particular, and this is a factor that we can see being driven particularly by the crisis in care that the pandemic has also exposed and deepened, and the gendered nature of that. Now, interesting, girls also voiced the desire to earn money in the face of these increased hardships that they were facing. Not just the fact that they were not able to go to school, but also the fact that everything costs a lot more and the families were suffering from increased cycles of poverty. And despite the burden of labor, there was no romanticization here around the idea of working. It was still a necessary thing that they felt they should be engaging with. If we can move to the next slide, please. And so what I want to do is to situate that a little bit within this wider approach to gender justice and economic rights that we work with. So the gendered nature of income loss within COVID-19 is quite critical, and I have already sort of broken that down. But following through from that, you know, the reduced expenditure on food, medicines, personal care products, and the escalation of costs around that have all been a contributing factor, with higher risks of poverty cycles, etc. And when we look at it, that exploitation in multiple contexts, both in the home and in the street. So we have a scenario where essentially many of the prolonged recessions that are going to occur on the back of this pandemic will have a disproportionate effect on girls in particular. And even as here in the UK, for many of us, it feels as if we have moved past the pandemic as an experience. You know, you just go anywhere else, particularly in the global south, and it is a continuing cycle with actually additional waves even coming up now. The increased debt burdens that those countries are also facing is a contributing factor which we will not have to address. And yet, interestingly, and this is where we get to that macro analysis, the government support packages, you know, were not properly designed on the back of the pandemic to meet the needs of women and girls. And so what you find, for example, is that, you know, in one of our other reports, which came out quite quickly after the pandemic started, our Young Urban Women's Project, we found that 52% of young women surveyed had not received any benefits or social protection at all. And, you know, UNDP famously, along with UN Women, has a gender responsive tracker to COVID responses. And they highlighted that globally, only 19.6% of over 3,000 social protection and labor measures were gender sensitive, with just a tiny proportion of that going to the specific needs of girls in particular. And when we look at Indonesia, which obviously is the country that, you know, I have focused on here, their responses were largely gender insensitive, with many of the key challenges such as unpaid care, you know, education, child marriage completely overlooked. And even though some measures later on came in to support activities for women, these were largely economic ones based again on this idea of output and productivity and income earning. And so they didn't address the critical social safety nets that were needed, and particularly the girls within households need, to prevent them from going into work, into the informal sector, which does take place in the street context, the market context for the most part. And as a result, unfortunately, a lot of pre-COVID policy gains in the country suffered. So, you know, a raised age of marriage in 2019, has not been able to withstand the increased rates of child marriage that have followed on the back of girls dropping out, as well as, some interesting policies that were put forward to try and address dropouts through grant programs, have again not been able to be rolled out or to maintain their momentum. So that rollback of gender equality and that rollback of progress that we often hear talked about is there, but very important to specify as well that Indonesia is not unique in this. Nearly every country in the world had a poor record when it came to really being able to address the structural issues at play. And my final slide, please. So this brings me to the final sort of thing to talk about. And I know I have rushed through this quite a bit, but I know we only had 5 minutes each. So very happy to answer anything that needs more elaboration afterwards. But I think when we look at the idea of a post-COVID recovery, and when we look at it from the ActionAid UK framing in particular, of it needing to be gender just, and how that can then in turn also tackle child labour, we must look at the wider macro picture. So, we've got a greater systemic economic precarity of women and girls that existed before the pandemic, and that has to be acknowledged. We've also got the perpetually unaddressed question of unpaid care and domestic work. And this is critical when we look at child labour, because there is so much fluidity in that space, not just in terms of domestic work, but the way in which women's own informal work, and we know that women dominate the informal sector, often meshes and has a sort of morphed existence with that domestic work, as well as the work that they do for the market, and the role that girls end up playing in that as a result of the gendered segregation of labour. Now, very critically, those persistent deficits in publicly funded universal services that are specifically responsive to girls' needs, which existed again prior to the pandemic and which are suffering even more now, need to be addressed at the macro level and holistically. And so we're also talking about wider infrastructural services, water, sanitation, transportation, as well as funding for VOG services. And what this means is that the austerity policies, which many countries were already dealing with over the past decade prior to the pandemic, and which are now deepening on the back of the pandemic, are exacerbating all of this, as well as the affordability of food and basic goods. So, we're talking about cuts to public services, but we're also talking about, regressive taxation policies coming in. We're talking about the removal of subsidies to food and energy and fuel, all of which push households into deeper realms of poverty and push girls and children more broadly onto the street when they should be in school. So those opportunity cost decisions are being taken under great stress. And so we've got this further marginalization of access to their economic rights, when we go beyond this livelihoods and income generation situation. And so we really do need these wider macroeconomic shifts to also be looked at beyond many of the social norm focus interventions that we have at the micro level. And we see the importance of that, and the girl-led research has been critical in trying to shift power into the hands of girls so that it can enact those changes at the community levels with parents, with households, with community leaders, etc. That's absolutely critical. But truth be told, unless we address some of these structural systemic issues, that will often be in vain. And this does have policy implications. And again, very happy to elaborate on this if it's not completely clear, and particularly issues of policy sovereignty. Most countries do not choose, most developing countries do not choose austerity policies themselves. It's often something that's imposed, often with loan conditionalities. And so this has wider implications for what the UK government's positioning is on policy sovereignty around many of these issues at the macro level, and how that has impacts on this particular issue of child labour and street children. And that plays out at the national level as well as in global spaces. And that's me. I'll just ask for the last slide to be shown up so we can see just the fabulous report which is being launched in another room. Please check it out. It has a wealth of information about the critical importance of actually working through a feminist research approach with girls, as girls lead the research into what they believe is deemed important for their lives and their future. And I'll stop there. Bit of a whirlwind.
Thank you so much, Matt. It was a whirlwind tour. It's a very detailed whirlwind tour, but we'll calculate it maybe at the end of this session, but definitely over the coming weeks and months. But we'd really appreciate more that you could give to us as the inquiry progresses, please. I'd now like to bring in Ginny Baumann.
That's me.
A person in the flesh.
A real person, yes.
Yes. I'm Sarah. This is Desmond. These are two, I don't know if you've been introduced, two members of my team, Lucy and Claire. Over to you and the virtual colleagues.
Great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to come and talk about this. So I'm the Senior Programme Manager at the Freedom Fund, based here and then with colleagues around in different countries. So just to mention our organisation's work on child labour, we're supporting over 140 NGOs working against forms of slavery in 9 countries at the moment, offering multi-year support for those programmes.
Rattle through what the countries
are. Yeah. So Ethiopia, India, Nepal, Myanmar, Indonesia, Brazil, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Kenya. I think that adds up to 9. So in terms of the work on child labour specifically, it includes, for example, work on child domestic work in Ethiopia, children working with their families in Nepal under bonded labour or bonded agricultural labour, children in commercial sexual exploitation in Brazil, and children and adolescents working across multiple sectors in India. So it comes out in very different forms in different places. And it's an issue that I've been working on since 2000 on child labour and slavery. And then with the Freedom Fund since we started in 2014.
Why did you start? What was your objective?
What the Freedom Fund? Yeah, is to bring resources and political will to the issue of modern slavery. And then obviously child labour is within that, which I can talk about a little bit more on definitions at a later stage, if that's helpful. But what I wanted to do is jump straight into the strategies that we find to be effective in tackling child labour, strategies that are targeted at the drivers of the problem. So these are some ways forward. I think clearly it's important to target areas where there's a high prevalence of the problem. And we found that we must start with in-depth listening and planning with the clusters of civil society organisations and concerned officials who are working within that context. And as part of that, our practice is to sit with the affected families and with survivors of child labour to understand the realities from their point of view. And I think that's particularly important because we feel you can't address child labour as an externally driven thing. It has to, you can't tell people you have this problem. It's got to come from the context. And when we do that and we bring the local experts to the problem, we find there are 3 key components that we can then support. The first is to enable those communities to become organised around child protection. And that means investing in their capacity to understand the impacts of exploitation and violence against children. And to do that, we have to create some tools and processes from within the context, so not generic tools. And then investing in that community's ability to identify the vulnerable children and connect them with school attendance and to their families' entitlements. In many of these countries, although they're, it's a poverty-affected situation, there are often statutory entitlements that those families should be getting, but they need to be connected to them. We found that enabling groups to collect their own information about what's happening and to make sense of it themselves is essential. And then this can create the space for affected families and local leaders and teachers and service providers to start to challenge the normality of child labour.
And can I, maybe there's some sort of, you have the cursor being in the room so you can get to you more easily.
That's fine, it may take longer than 5 minutes.
So I'm just sat here thinking, I started doing washing up in my local pub when I was 13. But I was still going to school, it was part-time,
exactly.
And I wanted to do it.
Yes.
So how are you making the distinction of what is child labour? Is it full time? Is it that the state has that you should be in school until you're 14 and they're working at 30? Do you make a distinction between exploitative child labour and child labour? Do you see all child labour as modern slavery? Sort of tell us what's the bad stuff that we ought to be looking at. When does it sort of get to, oh shit, there's something going on here, rather than me washing up in my local pub?
Exactly, or me being a chain bank on Saturdays. Yeah. So obviously choice is one thing. Does it affect their ability to go to school? Does it have any hazard to the work? And these are all taken from ILO definitions. I think that has to be the touch point for the ILO, the International Labour Organization, because they make the distinction between children working, which could be somebody learning the craft of their parents. They do it for an hour in the morning, they go to school, they come back, maybe they do another hour, but they can still do their homework and it doesn't have a bad effect on them. So there's child work. Then there's child labour, which does do some harm to the child. There's a lot of working hours, perhaps. And then there's the worst forms of child labour, which would be, very hazardous work, work that might be abusive to the child. Forced work would fall into that category. So I think it's important to keep those distinctions in mind. So the Freedom Fund tends to be working on the worst forms of child labour. And in fact, when I've travelled around in many of these places, I find it hard to find the children working thing where I look at it and I think, oh, that's all right. It's just not a category that I tend to come across. Maybe it tends to be because of where I am.
And you also brought in the phrase bonded labour.
Yeah.
So how is that different from modern slavery?
It's part of the definition of it's one of the subcategories within modern slavery from our understanding. So usually it's where there's an economic dimension to it, and the family, perhaps they need some medical care, or they need, someone to get married, and then they take a loan from their employer, and then they don't get the pay that they should be getting. And they also can't leave. That's the important thing. You lose your free agency to go to a different employer. If you have a debt to someone, we've all got a mortgage, right? That's not slavery. You go work for somebody else. It's when you can't leave the employer that you're with.
So is bonded labour like indentured labour would it be? So that you're basically owned, technically you're getting a wage, but effectively you're linked to that person.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I think with indentured labour, there was usually a time period, whereas bonded,
kind of extended.
yes, obviously, that's right. But with bonded labour, what we tend to see is it passes down the generations.
Okay. So they might live on the estate, and there's an assumption that they will work in the estate. And okay.
Yes, that's right. It could be a physical thing, but so that's that. But changing that norm where, well, his father works for him, so then he needs to do it. So, what do we do to create the possibility of changing that norm? And what we find is that when you go through that process in the community, people start to be willing to reach out to local employers, whether they're people working for them or they're the teachers, they're, the village leaders, or it could be property owners that are allowing the use of child labour. And it's creating that other norm within the community that actually all the children should be at school, they shouldn't be working. And that also will lead them to be willing to report on child trafficking, which is another factor. So that's one area of work is with the community and changing norms there. I think the second thing that we find that local experts will come back to us and want to change is about educational access. And you can't solve child labour without solving, issues to do with access to education. And that means both the enrolment of children and then actual attendance. And that needs to reach the children who are the lowest status and the most discriminated categories. And what we found, it's quite interesting, is that the single most effective step against child labour is actually to make free school meals available. that was something I watched in India as it, particularly in the state of Bihar, as it became more the practice that school meals were actually available, is that really made sense to the families. Is that, oh yeah, if they go there, they get a meal. You know, we're not sure about the quality of the education, but it's worth them going. So tackling the education issues, and then of course the economic factors. So looking at adult livelihoods, workplace organising, as well as economic safety net entitlements. So basically we have to help, you know, the work against child labour has to protect these families from economic and environmental shocks that devastate their economic well-being. We find that when adult worker groups are formed and they're focused on improving working conditions, those groups can be very powerful in identifying and reducing child labour. And I think there are so many initiatives in the anti-slavery space, which I'm sure we'll talk about business supply chains. But unless the workers in those places can bargain effectively and collectively, and they can speak out about issues in the workplace, those business initiatives are never going to reach. They're always going to be superficial, and child labour will persist. So I think as the Freedom Fund, we do have confidence in these area-based initiatives, and they can become a focal point for the kind of systems level change that Fatimah was talking about, which are obviously completely vital. And having that local ownership is important. The other thing we found is that the advantage of these concentrated efforts is you can actually measure the impact. You can say, well, this is where we started, and now 4 or 5 years later, because it is a multi-year process, we can see the difference. And what that does is it allows us to learn from what we're doing and say, well, in this place we did a bit more on education, this place we did a bit more on livelihoods, and what's making the difference. But also it makes people believe that you can do something about this. This is by no means an intractable problem. And that's where the question of political will comes back, from the village level right up to the international level. It's if we decide we can do something about this.
And have you seen cases where it's been brought back?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, from the local level where interventions in India that we were involved in, where we were doing it over hundreds of villages, and we measured the change where there were, you know, bonded labour was at around 50%, because we were targeting the villages. I would never suggest that India has 50%, but we were targeting the villages very carefully, and there were very high levels of bonded labour.
And what were the children doing? Give us some.
Yeah, so agriculture, stone breaking, brick kilns.
And what age?
Most of the child work and child labour in this case was 10 upwards.
And boys and girls.
Boys and girls, yeah, definitely. And obviously segregated by gender into some of those roles. And by the time this was 2015 to 2018, by 2018 it had come down to about 12%. Wow. Massive reduction. And that's partly because we were working in a place where you could invoke important social entitlements. So it wasn't that we as the Freedom Fund had to bring everything in. If you were working in a country with much reduced social entitlements, or where they just couldn't be made to work, you wouldn't see that level of change. You'd see some change.
So what social entitlements, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, I mean, thinking about India, they have an employment guarantee where if you're a family that doesn't have income, you can get 100 days of paid work, very low paid, but it will keep you in food. They do have a public distribution system for food rations, and that system can work pretty well, getting people onto that. Obviously, there are the free school meals. There's housing as well for certain categories of people. So it's looking at each household and saying, what are you getting, what are you not getting, and then working with the local officials to make it happen. And having a group in that community that sees this as their job, that they want to, you know, the objective is we don't want anyone in bonded labour, we don't want the children working. Okay, what do we have to do about that? Well, schools have to work into the commitments, etc.
And in that particular example, would you say it was just, I don't want to say a habit, but sort of a cultural norm that the children would go into it? or was it a lack of awareness about what the alternatives were?
I think it's community organising around these issues and then working with the authorities to create demand. So, making the schools work better. I don't think awareness raising on its own makes hardly any difference at all. Definitely changing the norms, but you have to create opportunity. There's a lot of, especially in the field of migration, where migration turns into trafficking, there's been so much work of just telling people it could go wrong, it could go wrong. They all know that.
Yeah.
They all know that, yeah. It's not what we do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
I pulled you off your...
No, that's it. That was well over my 5 minutes.
Jiniya, are you...
We have Ginny. I've just been told Ginny hasn't been able to join us. I think no. Traffic has
Just defeated her.
completely defeated her, which is
Oh.
online. So she I don't know if she may still join us, but I think let's move to questions. And then if Ginny joins us, she can introduce herself.
Just on that, this morning we had the Working Pensions Select Committee, one of our witnesses, having notwithstanding having spent the night in a hotel in London, got stuck in the traffic on the way, and nipped out into a park, and we had him on on his phone. My question is about where you've got subsistence farming, as you have in so many developing countries. The inevitability of children going to be working on the family enterprise, and particularly where you have schooling which is done in shifts. As many countries, you will have half because of the shortage of schools, half the children in the morning and the other half in the afternoon. And those children who are for the afternoon shift get a raw deal because they will have been working all morning and will be tired and hungrier. And what's more, the teachers who will be teaching them will have been working all morning as well. And I just wonder if there's any way that, within the inevitability of subsistence enterprises, there's anything that be done to address that? Is there any solution?
Yeah, I've seen some work going on in Ghana. I know we referred to the chocolate issue earlier. It's been over many years actually work done within cocoa farming, where both local children and in some cases trafficked children have been brought in. And it does come down to these community initiatives again, of saying it's not about no child ever working on anything, but it's looking together about, well, what are the impacts on the children? How do we stop them coming near pesticides? How do we stop them having these dangerous machetes? And at what age should different tasks be possible? It's obviously one thing if it's a 16-year-old who's carrying the sacks, but it shouldn't be a 10-year-old, and they probably shouldn't be working in the field anyway. And I think once you've got more community buy-in, and actually the owners of the subsistence farms buying into that concept, and everybody's doing it together, it's much easier to push things in the direction of not harming the children. I don't know whether that totally answers. I also don't want to dominate the answering of questions with Fatima's expertise as well.
Thoughts on this?
Yes, I'd be happy to answer that. So a lot of my previous work actually to ActionAid has been in the agricultural sector, particularly in Nigeria, where I'm a dual Nigerian and British national. So for the last 10 years, I decided to focus a lot of my work in northern Nigeria, where I'm from, the personal being political, as we call it. And what I would say, I don't disagree with that at all. I think that approach is necessary. What I will add to that is beyond the community buy-in, which is absolutely critical, because the positioning around the social norms can be so strong. This issue of opportunity cost cannot really be dismissed. The point around education is absolutely critical, and similar to Sarah, I got my first job at 15, working in a bakery, and it was a Saturday job. I got £17.50 for it. This was back in the dark ages, obviously, and
you're much younger than me.
Same here.
Yeah, so sometime back in the late 80s, and I was but there was a very clear legal framework that allowed me to do that, which also protected me. So I could only do a certain number of hours. I was 15, had to get, a sign off from parents, school, etc. And in the absence of that, we find this is where these lines become extremely blurred. And so once you get those frameworks into place, and once you get the investment needed into place to ensure that there is a school, and I completely agree with the importance of school meals. So, the education space has demonstrated, not just in the last 20 years with the Millennium Development Goals, but if we go back to our own history here in the UK, the transition to full universal basic education, which happened between the wars and after the Second World War, with the expansion of the welfare state, was heavily dependent on social protection and incentives, including school meals. And again, the personal being political, my father was born in 1915 and grew up between the wars. And so I grew up listening to first-hand stories of the absence of what we take for granted today in terms of social protection, free school meals, but also child benefit. The introduction of all of those made an enormous shift, and what we would consider to be sort of intractable social norms that require lots of cultural changes and shifts can actually be helped along far more quickly when countries are able to make those investments and are able to make those public spending shifts alongside the really important grassroots community work that has already been mentioned that needs to happen at the civil society level. And that whether you're talking about the rural areas with subsistence farming or whether you're talking about the cities.
I think that comes back to one of the questions that I think you're going to look at later, which is what can the UK government do? How do we? What can you do? Since you asked, I think ensuring that an adequate percentage of UK aid is going towards what is now an education emergency around the world. There's a group in the Netherlands that's calling on their government to make sure that 5%, which sounds like a rather small amount, but I know there's lots of other agendas, is devoted to education in their government's aid. And I think if the UK government could also set a target and publish on it, then we could see that we're playing an appropriate role.
I commonly defend the Prime Minister. He is really committed to girls' education. And one of the strands that we've got in the new development strategy is girls' education. So,
Yes,
so do you need to see a percentage figure, or do you what actually is it that you would like to see? And I'll say that to both of you.
Yeah.
What are the specifics that could be used to hold them to account? Because £100 million spent poorly or £10 million spent well, there's a big difference. So if it's not just the monetary thing.
Yes, but the monetary thing comes first. That's the top priority, is how much is there. And then obviously the gender dimension is crucial. But then I think also we're looking from a slavery point of view at the groups that are most severely discriminated. So you can have the kids in the school, but if they're sitting in the back and they're more subject to corporal punishment, and if some children are the ones that get given the broom at the end of the day to sweep up because they're of the wrong group, they're not going to want to be there. Mm-hmm. And that's what we hear when we talk to these kids is, I don't want to go to school, it's not safe for me. Mm-hmm. So some of that money should be spent well on making schools safe for all children. And then I think also extending, because at the moment there's a lot of focus on the 6 to 14 age group. That's great. Again, as a slavery issue, it's the 15 to 18-year-olds that are extremely vulnerable because school is no longer much use to them. The skills training for the ones that didn't get literacy at that point is again not going to be available. The only choice is to go off with the traffic or go into some severe form of child labour. I think those would be a few pointers, but I think getting a percentage in there would be hugely helpful.
I wonder if you could both comment on birth registrations. a lot of children, not a lot, there's a lot of missing children around the world and also in the UK. Would registering, having a big push to register those children help with addressing this?
Yeah, I think that's sort of foundational, isn't it? I think that would be a really helpful thing to do. I think the other thing it helps to do is establish how old are they, because then you can have whatever framework, but if the employer is saying, no, he's 16, he's 18, well, you know, having a birth certificate would be good. We often do that through the schools because they may not have originally had a birth certificate, but the schools are able to be one source of saying, how old is this person? Oh.
Jiniya, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you see us?
You're muted, we can tell you that much.
Jiniya, you're on mute. Are you able to put the sound on?
Hi, can you hear me?
Oh, we can hear you. And you can obviously hear
Okay,
us.
let me check my sound. I don't think I can hear you.
Jiniya, can you hear us now? Is she in Bangladesh?
Yeah.
You can hear the Dr. Traffic.
Jiniya, can you hear us or can you see us?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Can you hear
Yeah.
us?
Yeah.
Could you, I'll tell you what, if we'll just ask you to talk while we've got the signal.
Yes.
So could you tell us who you are, your organisation, and tell us a little bit about child labour?
Hi, apologies for delay and I'm traveling, so it's sorry for that. So I'm Jiniya. I'm working as the country coordinator for CLARISSA program in Bangladesh. I don't know whether you have already had some introduction on CLARISSA. If not, then it's a consortium partnership program, which is addressing worst form of child labor, particularly in Bangladesh. The focus is on leather industry. So our focus is mostly on the small businesses in the informal space, where we understand that children are mostly engaged in work that is exploitative and hazardous for their well-being, and which also has the risk of, to have more physical, psychological, sexual abuse and exploitation. So in Bangladesh, I mean, as in many countries in the world, I mean, child labor is common. We understand that many children need to work, while there is government initiatives in the past few decades where efforts have been made to reduce children's engagement into work, but there are many reasons which push children into work. Poverty is considered to be one of the reasons, but through our work in CLARISSA, we have collected life stories from children both in Bangladesh and in Nepal. So we have collected 800 life stories from 800 children, and some stories were collected by children themselves. The stories were analyzed by the children themselves in a participatory way. And all the children are working in hazardous and exploitative work, and in situation which is very dangerous for their life in terms of their safety and well-being. So through the life history analysis process, we have got a deeper understanding about the dynamics in children's life and the factors that drives children to be into exploitative work. And we see that poverty is often not the only or primary factor. There are different other relations that affect them in terms of parents not taking the responsibilities, not having a strong social safety net, social protection system in the country. The education system is not, not considering. I mean, it's very monolithic, and it's not considerate about the children who need to work. Overall, there are various other reasons which also drives children into worse form of labor. So maybe I will stop now, and maybe if you have a question, we can go into that.
Could you talk to us a little more about the businesses that are involved in this practice?
So as I say, the business that in Bangladesh, we're focusing on leather supply chain. So it involves children engaged in, rearing cattle to, slaughtering, to processing raw hides, then tying, drying, then producing finished products, till transportation and all other sites. And we found that children as young as 8 to 10 years old, they start working. In our attempt to understand the neighborhood dynamics in the community where we are working, in an urban slum in Dhaka, we find that there are that there's safety in the community is a factor. For example, often parents who need to work, they consider that it's safer for children to work when they are away, and because in the community there is no protection system, community protection system is not strong enough, where children can, children can be, because children need to be just be themselves. So there are small factories. Some of these are home-based, some are very close to the neighborhood where they stay. So they feel that if my son or my daughter goes to the business and try to learn something which will ultimately help them to get some skills, and considering the mainstream education doesn't bring much hope and aspiration. So they feel that if they start learning something, eventually they will be able to contribute to the family's income. So the children need to work in, I'm talking about very small factories, not the big one, because the large big businesses are more regulated. Those are inspected regularly, and we know that the global supply chain has more focus on that. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about as small as factories which have 20 employees maybe, or maybe 10, 15 employees. So there, the way the businesses work, they also, these small businesses get subcontract. So when big or maybe medium-sized businesses get some work order, probably they can't manage it within their workforce, then they outsource those to small businesses because it's cheaper, and then they don't need to regulate, and they get cheap labor. Therefore they need cheap labor to prepare those products. So children often work without any contract. The hiring process is very random. They do not have contract workplace. The work hour is not defined. So they need to often work 10, 12, 14 hours. The workplace condition is very unhealthy and unhygienic. They do not get proper time to rest. And they need to, in the leather supply chain, often they need to work in heavy machineries, work with chemicals. So it's not like a structured factory where they use, equipments, safety equipments or hand gloves to use those chemicals. They use just their hands to use different chemicals, which apparently they do not see the immediate impact of negative consequences of this, but those have some long-term consequences in their health. So yeah, this leather, so mostly, I mean, children are involved in various processing, and they need to, for example, dry the raw hide under the sky, and it's just literally under the hot sun in temperature like 35 degree, 40 degree Celsius, and they're just nailing the they're just doing the nailing and maybe using some color to dye it, and that's what they're doing for the day. Yeah.
I've seen the leather industry, and I know what disgusting and hard work it is. The examples you've given are obviously exploitative working practices for anyone, let alone a child. Are you? Should we just focus on the exploitative child labour, or should we focus on all child labour?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, important question, as well as this needs much consideration as well. Of course, towards the end, child labor, I mean, no children should work. I mean, it's children's right to be safe, and it's right to have the education, etc. However, ending child labor cannot happen in one day, as we understand. I mean, there is many years of work and effort have been put in that. So we can't just say that we'll have to stop child labor at the outset. Maybe we need to have some more nuanced approach in that, where in CLARISSA, our intention is to understand from the lives of the children themselves, because we understand that they are the experts of their lives. So we try to understand. I mean, if in the worst case scenario, if children need to work, they need to work in a place where they can also learn something, and which contributes to their health and well-being. So, of course, I mean, no children should work, and that should be the ultimate goal. But that process needs to start from places where it's more hazardous, more exploitative, more hidden, and we don't even know that children are working there.
Thank you. No? Any additional questions? No? In that case, Jiniya, thank you so much for joining us. It sounds like you've had a very stressful time getting here. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Our next session is going to be on the 22nd of July. If you do have any thoughts that can shape this inquiry, we're particularly looking at sort of practical, pragmatic things that we can either ask the government to do or lobby to campaign on internationally. That would be really helpful if you could submit written evidence before our next session. But also if you can let other people know that we are open for written evidence now. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time. And thank you. This session is now over. And we can go out into the madhouse that is our normal every day. Thank you for coming, Betty.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fatimah. Thank you, Jiniya.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.